Hello YouTube, this is the Plastic Commando coming to you from deep behind enemy lines. Today we are making a video which I expect to be one of many videos to come on house rules and alternate strategy, alternate setup for Axis and Allies World War I 1914. As many of you know, the out-of-box rules setup for the game is very lopsided, to say the least, and heavy-handed towards the Allies. And I think to some extent it was possibly made that way. I can't speak for the creator of the game, Mr. Larry Harris, and those that were involved in the rules, but at the end of the day, it is a game, and when you take the time to set up your game and invite others over to play, you want to be able to have fun no matter which side you're on. And in my experience, and in listening to many others who have played the game and of course seen videos of Axis and Allies 1914 here on YouTube, it just seems to be an overwhelming consensus that the game, again, is it's unfortunately just heavy-handed to one side, and that being the Allies. However, what I have started doing, and I've got several house rules that I've got in place that I'm using, and in future videos I'll actually be presenting those into a game format that you'll be able to see how the house rules are working. And also I would welcome future comment and feedback on your thoughts on the house rules themselves. But today we're going to be focused on Africa. And of course, initially you might be saying, well, why Africa? I mean, there's nothing that goes on in Africa in this game. But again, that's another reason why I have instituted a house rule, because the African continent on the game board itself takes up a good portion of the game board. And what I've found is, obviously, as was in the war, most of the conflict took place in Western Europe, as well as the Eastern Front. However, there were many battles in Africa. They were just very small in size. But of particular interest was the battles and the campaigns in East Africa, German East Africa. And what I had noted initially from playing this game is that obviously there's just not a lot that goes on in Africa based on the setup of the game itself. But in particular, I had taken note of the initial setup for German East Africa seemed to be very lopsided in and of itself compared to, say, the German setup in Southwest Africa, for example. And the reason I say that is the majority of the fighting took place in German East Africa. In fact, the fighting in German East Africa took place and continued on to the end of the war. Whereas in most areas of Africa, throughout the continent, the colonial armies fought. They pretty much overwhelmingly took over, at least the British overwhelmingly took over the German territory with the assistance of the French as well. But as you know from the initial setup in the game itself, German East Africa starts out with 1 infantry. And when you read about the campaigns in Africa, in particular East Africa, you begin to find out that there was a great general that fought for the Germans and not only defended German East Africa, but again tied up many Allied troops, in particular British troops, throughout the war that otherwise could have been shifted up to Europe, or even into the Ottoman Empire to help take on the Ottomans. But Major General Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck, he was the commander in German East Africa. And based on his leadership, he tied up the Allies up until the end of the war. And in fact, he did not even surrender until about 2 days after the armistice was signed. So he managed to, without resupply from Germany, he managed to keep an army together and tie up and fight the Allies throughout the war. So for that reason, I have instituted a house rule that I believe will balance out the conflict in Africa a bit more realistically than what is presented just with the out-of-box rules itself. And so we're going to go ahead and let's dive into this setup as we see it here. But before we actually get into East Africa, I'll just pan around and show that, and again, if you've seen my other videos, the Germans that I'm using in Africa are alternate infantry, which I have painted based on the steps that I've shown in the process of painting and weathering, applying a shade and matte varnish. And these are hat miniatures, and I think for purposes of the colonial troops in Africa, they look really good. And so I'm going to be using those in my game, in particular Africa. And so what we've got in Cameroon, we've got an Askari soldier. And the Askari were African soldiers that worked with the German Schutztruppe. The Schutztruppe were the colonial Germans, and they hired quite a number of African colonial troops, and that made up really the largest part of the forces, in particular in East Africa. And then, of course, we've got Togo land over here with another alternate infantry, which I'll be using as well. So what we've got here in East Africa, we've got this little figure here, which I particularly like. A good representation of Major General Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck himself, wearing the colonial hat. And so I felt it very fitting, obviously, to paint up this miniature and utilize him. And then, of course, what I'll be also utilizing as a startup will be the Askari Schutztruppe soldiers that he was commanding at the time. Now, obviously, there were some German soldiers that were certainly involved in East Africa, but based on the information that I've read about the campaigns in East Africa, the Askari soldiers were about 4 to 5 to 1. In other words, there was about 10,000 or more Askari soldiers versus initially about 2,500 to 3,000 German colonial troops. So Major Vorbeck, he led quite a few colonials, and they were very loyal to their German masters, but I believe in part because they were paid well. So perhaps some of that loyalty was bought and paid for. But it did work out because the campaigns in East Africa did extend again to the very end of the war. So we're going to be using these alternate infantry, and you'll see instead of the one infantry that starts the game itself, I'm going to be utilizing 2 additional infantry because, again, I think this is going to be more representative of Major General Vorbeck's campaigns in East Africa, tying up the Allies, and also not being able to be resupplied from Europe throughout any portion of the time in the war in Africa. Although there were excursions in nearby provinces where the German army did obtain supplies and certainly which allowed them to hold out. And you'll notice that I do have a machine gun marker, and some of you probably have seen these. If not, these are available through Historical Board Gaming. And part of many of the rules, which house rules that I'll be instituting in this game, is the machine gun marker. And I'll have a later video on the rules that I'm going to be utilizing, but for purposes of today, you'll notice that I'm actually going to have one machine gun unit, which is going to be entirely for defense, as the machine guns were utilized. And then, of course, we've got a cruiser. We have a cruiser off the coast of East Africa, which is not part of the out-of-box setup. And the reason that I have a cruiser is that if you'll look at a lot of the historical writings of the East African campaign, the German cruiser, the Königsberg, was actually in the Indian Ocean at the beginning of World War I and made its way down into the lower part of the Indian Ocean. And of course, the way our game board is set up, it's hard to actually position the pieces other than towards in the Africa campaign, right off of East Africa. But there was a German cruiser that was at the beginning of World War I, excuse me, was present, and it did catch the eye of the British Navy and caused them some concern, and it also tied up forces chasing after the Königsberg. And I feel like that this will be a house rule which I'm going to utilize in the game itself, and again in a future video we're going to dive into how these rules work, in particular the use of the machine gun infantry for defense, which will stiffen up the German East Africa campaign. And I think that you'll see that with this particular setup, we're going to be bringing a bit more balance to the game itself, at least within the Africa campaigns and the fighting that did take place throughout the war under the leadership of General Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck. So hang tight, and I'm going to go into a few moves based on the limited setup which I have on the game board to illustrate the impact of this house rule, and also the potential worth of actually utilizing a setup in the game, in particular in the East Africa territory, that I believe is more historically accurate, but also will make Africa in the game itself a bit more competitive, as opposed to being extremely lopsided and a portion of the game board itself that really no one pays attention to. So hang tight, and we're going to come back and get to a few moves on the game board to illustrate how this set of house rules will work. Okay, we're going to go through a few playtest movements in using the house rules for German East Africa, which we had went over previously. And I'm going to take you through a few steps to show how the use of the house rules for gameplay in Africa. And before I do that, I'm actually going to move my cruiser back in place. We're going to go through and show how these rules are actually beneficial in actually shaking things up in Africa, in the African continent, in particular for the game, but also the same way that Major General Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck shook things up tremendously throughout the war by tying up various Allied armies and fighting a campaign in Africa that frankly no one had been able to achieve throughout the war. So what we can do is from the initial look, we've got two infantry in play. We've got one infantry that's designated as a machine gun unit. Now, I'll dive in later on another video about how the machine gun unit actually works, but for purposes of this video, at the time of purchase for a machine gun unit, it would be the same as purchasing an infantry. However, to make that infantry unit a machine gun unit, it would cost an extra IPC, so a total of 4 IPCs for a machine gun infantry unit. And in doing so, that infantry unit as a machine gun designation can only defend and cannot attack, as the machine guns were used as a defensive weapon during the war, so they'll be used in this game as well, again, according to my house rule. So that will bolster the defense of a territory. However, consideration has to be made in making attacks, because again, that unit itself would not be able to move into, say, a neighboring province such as British East Africa and make an attack along with the 2 infantry. So for starters, we could potentially take the 2 infantry, if we so desired, and attack British East Africa. However, that may be very tight, given that defending infantry defends on a 3 or less, versus attacking infantry. In this case, we've got 2 infantry would actually attack on a 2 or less. So that may not be a very good move from the get-go. And so in that case, what I would do is keep the forces as a defensive unit only on the opening round, and hopefully, depending on the player and the strategy, hopefully encourage both British units to make an attack, and in doing so would be foolhardy at best, because again, there would be 2 infantry on a 2 or less versus having 2 infantry defending on a 3 or less, and then 1 machine gun unit that, again, according to my house rules, will defend on a 4 or less. So that would not be a good move either for the British player. So the first round would effectively establish a defensive position, similar to how things played out into the war. And then what would be a possibility then would be moving further Schutztruppe units either into Belgian Congo to bring those units closer to East Africa. And I'd actually moved this one from Togoland previously, but into Nigeria, which again would pick up another IPC. Or we could leave the unit in Cameroon with the unit from Togoland to come into Nigeria with the idea of consolidating these 2, and then ultimately trying to bring a much larger force towards East Africa to consolidate a much larger force for attacks later. And then of course we've got Southwest Africa, which we do have an infantry unit and an artillery unit that is paired 1-to-1 with the forces in South Africa. So this does open up possibilities of forcing the British player to make a more rational decision on sending forces in immediately to attack, whereas from the out-of-box rules, there was, again, only 1 unit that would be in East Africa, and typically how things would play out based on the house rules is you would have both of the British infantry units that would come in and generally take the 1 infantry unit out, effectively taking over East Africa in round 1. So in this case, it does produce a more defensive posture with the British, and it will buy time to perhaps consolidate your forces together. And again, ultimately, depending upon the move of the British player, maybe taking advantage of a mistake, wanting to attack too soon and lose an infantry unit. For example, British player could, in the next turn, attack from South Africa into Southwest Africa and lose, which would bolster the German position on the southern end of Africa, while you already have a stronger defense posture and position in German East Africa. So the added house rule will actually provide more ground possibilities in Africa than the initial out-of-box rules allowed for just 1 infantry unit. So there's a few possibilities depending upon how the British player will react after your turn. And then moving into the second round, bringing air forces in, and then ultimately trying to see how those forces can consolidate with the idea of hopefully making an attack with British units, because again, there essentially is no resupply of German units in this game, as was the case in the war. Now, up on the northern end, obviously we've got substantial forces, British forces in Egypt. We've got one unit in Anglo-Egyptian Sudan. Now, after the infantry units, the German infantry units are moved into a position, and let's just say we move the one infantry from Togoland into Nigeria, and that's our move in Africa. So then when it comes the British player's turn, what the British player may want to do, hypothetically, is move an infantry unit down into British East Africa to help consolidate their position. The British player may feel a bit emboldened by the forces in Egypt, want to go ahead and move in the 2 artillery with some infantry units. Let's say the British player, who starts with 6 infantry units, wants to move in, well, let's just say this unit's here for purposes of the video. Let's say the British infantry unit wants to move in, the British player moves in 4 units, leaves 2 infantry units in Egypt, along with the artillery, with the idea of the following round moving forces into British East Africa, setting up a battle that can ultimately take out German East Africa and try to kick out the German forces in Africa. Is typically how the game progresses anyway. So that may be an enticement with German East Africa, a bit more defensive, may be an enticement for the British player to actually consolidate some forces, move those to the southeast rather, and then want to go ahead and take on the greater force of the Germans. Now, in doing that though, as again, another way that a force like this would keep the British units from just arbitrarily coming in and running over East Africa and then essentially the remainder of the continent, is that in doing that, it weakens Egypt substantially, leaving only 2 British infantry. Whereas in Transjordan, with the Ottomans breathing down Egypt's neck, we've got, of course, at the beginning, 2 infantry units, 1 artillery. That may force the British player to leave more forces in Egypt, again, thus allowing more time for you to establish a defensive position, a posture, ultimately an attack position in East Africa. Or the British player may choose, again, feeling emboldened, want to go southeast, and at the peril of Egypt, could allow Ottoman forces to perhaps make an attack into Egypt, which would possibly be unlikely on the first round because it would still be a close battle. But then with the consecutive round, the British forces could perhaps easily come in and mop Egypt back up. But what it would do though is if the Egyptian forces are moved south, on the next round right after the British turn, the Ottomans would move. The Ottomans could then take, let's just say for purposes of the video, let's take all 6 infantry and artillery unit and then align itself adjacent to Egypt from Transjordan. So what that would do then would put pressure on the British to not go south, but perhaps either return to Egypt or not leave Egypt at all, and then perhaps even move in another force from Anglo-Egypt Sudan into Egypt, given the weight of the Ottomans that are looking to cross over and take over Egypt. So that's again one other possibility that having the out-of-box rule, or excuse me, the house rules as opposed to the out-of-box rules would tie up British forces up in the upper northern side of the continent, the northeast side. Again, just as in history, Major General Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck did himself, tying up key forces within the continent and allowing those forces to not move as free as they might want to do, and perhaps move on to other battlefields. So I think this house rule is going to actually open up a number of possibilities on the continent. And depending upon how combat would go on the ground, it could actually help the Ottomans as well in perhaps attacking Egypt. So those are just a few possibilities on the land itself. Now, just real quick with the cruiser, naval units move two game spaces versus the cruiser, which can move up to 3. Now, just as the cruiser during World War I caused a ruckus, the cruiser was pursued by the British Navy, and in this case, if the British was to move the 2 spaces down into Sea Zone 26, let's say along with the cruiser, it would not be wise for the German player just to leave the cruiser in tow, but what I would recommend is take advantage of the 3 spaces and even move over to Sea Zone 24 during the movement phase for the German player, or perhaps even into Sea Zone 23, and that essentially causes the British player to take chase, again tying up much needed naval units that perhaps could either go through the Suez Canal on in the Mediterranean. So what in essence this cruiser will do is force the British player either to chase or give the freedom of the cruiser to perhaps move around the west side of Africa and cause trouble on that end. Now, in that process, the French fleet may want to cut off the cruiser itself. And if that is the case, what'll happen is the Mediterranean will start to get fewer Allied ships in place, which could, in essence, open up some possibilities for the Austrian Navy to perhaps come down and make a more effective attack with fewer ships in the Mediterranean. The British ships, the cruiser and the transport, could either stay or could either move out and come down this way, depending upon how the British player would move. If that would be the case, if the German cruiser is actually in play on the following round and the British player had not moved any ships, this cruiser could effectively fire at and take on one of the British cruisers, perhaps knocking out 2 ships. So it does lend possibilities, but having a cruiser does impact the naval movements of the British, does give them something to think about. So this is just a few examples of a house rule that I'm going to be using in German East Africa. It'll be in gameplay moving forward, and I'm gonna test it out a few times just to see how it works. But I've play tested a few times myself, and it does seem to make a good impact into the war in Africa. And we'll certainly have a video up where we're going to run through the test on this. So I appreciate each of you tuning in, and we're going to have some other videos coming up soon. Welcome any feedback that you may have, any comments, questions, and also I'd like to hear about some house rules that you may have. This is the Plastic Commando, over and out.